Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and implement our button handler. So we added it in kind of right at the beginning, but we didn't actually implement it yet, and that's because we were focusing more on the properties and the attributes. So now I'm going to explain exactly what will happen once the button is pressed, so exactly how our button action function is going to work, and we're going to demonstrate how it works by having the button title and color change only once a button is pressed. So as of right now, we have it changing right when the app loads. So as soon as the code runs and the app runs, the button title and color is changing. Now we're going to have this change only once the button is pressed. Alright, so now we're going to move on to the final part, which will be how to handle the button press itself. So we've looked at how to change properties and how to retrieve properties, and we've done that in the change button properties function. I'm just going to get rid of some of the space. Now let's scroll down to the handler, and this will actually do something once the button is pressed, because right now it's not really doing anything once it's pressed. Okay, so we looked at how to change the title and the title color. Now, and this was changed once the button was loaded. Now why don't we go ahead and move this text down to the btn button action function so that it only changes once the button is pressed. So what we're going to do is I'm first going to create this other function, and this is going to be called do when button pressed. Okay, and I'm going to call it in the btn button action function. So do when button pressed. Okay, so again, much like with the view.load, it's a good idea to try not to include a lot of code inside of the btn button action function itself, so inside of the handler. So where possible, try to assign a function and then have the function do the work and then just call it in the btn button action function itself. Okay, so try not to cluster this up with a lot of unnecessary code. So what do we want to have happen when the button is pressed? Well, why don't we just do a simple task like changing the button text and the button color. So why don't we do exactly the same thing that we were doing on the load that we're doing or why don't we do the same thing in here that we were doing on the load. So I'm just going to cut this, so Command X, and paste this. In fact, why don't I just do this? I'm going to no longer call the change button properties in here. I'm just going to call it in here. Change button properties. So we kind of have an unnecessary function call now. We could have just called this change button properties inside of the button action, but you know, there's no point stepping back now. So what's going to happen is this is no longer going to change. We're no longer going to change the title, so set the title to Mammoth Interactive or set the color to red until the button is pressed. Okay, so this is basically saying, you know what, in fact, let's just get rid of this altogether and just do this function here, which is just change the button properties. So let's go over what's going to happen. Okay, so there's no call in the view.load, so that's fine. Nothing else is going to change except for what's already here. Then change button properties isn't being called yet, so that's fine. This is something that we don't need to worry about. And so this btn button action is basically going to say, once the button is pressed, do this task. Okay, so in Xamarin and in a few other different kind of IDEs, we had kind of a plus equals delegate. So that was, we had to call the button name and then a touch up inside and then a plus equals delegate, and then whatever happens would go in there. Okay, so this is not something that we have to do in Swift 3 using Xcode. We can just kind of put whatever we want to have happen when the button's pressed inside of this button action function. Okay, so this is going to perform everything within these two brackets when the button's pressed. Okay, so this is just going to be a simple task right now, such as setting the title color, okay, and the title text. So we don't really need to worry about this stuff. This is going to also set the label text and color. That's fine. That's just going to contain whatever this is right now, and then it's going to reset the title and the title color. So let's go ahead and see this in action. I'm just going to stop this and rerun it. Oh, and before we do, let's save this. So always a good idea to save your code as frequently as you possibly can. So I would really recommend that after you implement any big chunk of code, so any big function or a couple of functions or whatever, just keep saving it, because although this version, the beta 2 version, is it's a lot better so far than the beta 1, the beta 1 crashed a lot, so you don't want to be losing all your work. Okay, so we're just going to go ahead and run this. And yep, build succeeded, that's excellent. Okay, and here's our simulator set up. So as you can see, everything's just as it is because we haven't called this change button properties code yet. But if we were to press the button, there we go, see, everything's changing now. So, and then we get that changed again. Okay, so just to see what happened again, I'm just going to rerun this because we had a couple of different things happening there. Okay, so what did we see when we first loaded up the simulator? Well, it showed this exact screen because we hadn't called the change button properties yet. So again, I've said this a few times, but once the simulator loads up, until we reassign a value in the code and call the code to do that, it's just going to display whatever attributes we give it in this attributes inspector. Okay, and going to load up the simulator. Okay, so as you can see, it's just interesting text and label. Now, before we press the button, let's go over what's going to happen. So it's going to call this change button properties once it's pressed, and that's why we add this function, this button action function. Okay, so what we're going to see is we are first going to assign the label text to be the current button title, which is going to be interesting text. And then we're going to set the text color to be the current button title color, which is going to be blue. So we're going to be changing our label to interesting text, and it's going to be blue. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to execute these lines of code, which are going to be set our button title to Mammoth Interactive, and it's going to be set the button title color to red. Okay, so let's just press it, and there we go. We see we changed the text, or the label text color and the text itself, and then we change the button color and the button text. Now, we saw that when we pressed it again, it changed the label text. Okay, and that's because we're still calling this change button properties function once the button is pressed. So this is going to be the same thing that happens every time the button is pressed. And now we have a different button title and a different button color. So now the button title is Mammoth Interactive and the color is red, whereas before it was interesting text and it was blue. So now this is taking the current title and the current color. The current title is now Mammoth Interactive and the current color is now red, whereas before it was blue and interesting text. So if we press it again, it changes the label to contain whatever the current color and current title is, and that's a red Mammoth Interactive. And because we have already set our title to Mammoth Interactive and the color is red, the button title and color doesn't change. And if we were to press it again, we see that nothing else changes. And this is right because we set it to contain Mammoth Interactive and the color to be red. And this is just retrieving the current title and color, which is always going to be the same. It's always going to stay as Mammoth Interactive now. Okay, so that's why that stuff is happening. Again, this is just a very simple task, just changing the text colors, but we can do a lot more complicated stuff if we had, it's a good idea to assign button handlers to input text. So for example, if we were designing like a calculator or something, and let's say we have, we input 3 plus 3 or something, then when the button's pressed, we want to add 3 plus 3 and display it. Okay, so in that particular scenario, we might have two function calls. One function is going to take in the numbers and perform a calculation, and then the second function is just going to display the results of that calculation. Okay, so this is an example of where we might see a button handling in this case, a calculator. Okay, but the buttons are just there to handle any kind of event that we want. And now we've seen one working. So just to recap what we've seen so far in this part, we're going to be using this function button action, and it's going to have this sender, which is a UI button. So basically this just means that we have this button that when pressed will send some kind of an action and will trigger an event. And the event that it triggers is going to be whatever's in these two braces here, which in this case is going to be calling this function change button properties. Now this function change button properties is the same function that we had before. It just kind of set the label attributes and then set the title attributes, or the button title attributes. Okay, and then we saw that it first changed this to Mammoth Interactive in red, and then changed the label to contain this. And then once pressed again, it changed the label to contain the new current title and the new current title color. Okay, so that's how button handlers work. They, again, just send this, they take the UI button information and send it, and it triggers an event, and the event's whatever's within these curly braces, which in our case was just calling this function. Okay, so that's how you handle button presses, and that's going to be our final part on buttons. So this next part coming up is just going to be kind of a recap and a summary of what we've seen so far in this tutorial. Okay, so in this part of the tutorial we implemented the button handler. So we had kind of declared it before but not implemented it. So the way this handler works is it's going to be a button action function, and basically it will assign the button to be our sender, and the sender will basically just trigger an event when pressed. So we have a UI button as the sender, so basically once that UI button is pressed, it's going to send some kind of a trigger, and that's going to trigger an event. Okay, in our case the event was just calling the change button attributes function. So we saw that in our button action function we just put whatever we wanted to have happen when the button was pressed within the curly braces there. In our case it was just the change attributes function, which was doing the same things we were doing before, just changing the button text and the button text color. This time however we had it change only when the button was pressed rather than once the app was loaded. So in this way we demonstrated exactly what would happen once a button was pressed and how it would work. Alright, congratulations everyone for making it this far. You have successfully seen everything we have to learn in our buttons tutorial in Swift 3. So this part is just going to be a summary and a recap of what we've learned throughout this tutorial. Okay, so we started off by setting everything up. We have just remember that this is going to be the assistant editor view, and this allows us to view the layout as well as so this is going to be the main.storyboard where we have our layout, as well as a view controller.swift where we actually put our code. I'm just going to minimize this window to make more room. Okay, so once we had everything set up, we then looked at the layout and we added in a button. So this was under the views object. We chose the button, which is basically just an object that when pressed will trigger some kind of an event, and yeah, we'll have something happen once it's pressed. So we added this in, but just by dragging and dropping it like this. And then we added it into, and then once it was dragged and dropped into here, we can change the attributes directly using our attribute inspector and the size inspector. Okay, so the size inspector just allowed us to change the width and height and where it is in relation to the top and the left. Okay, and the attributes inspector allowed us to change stuff like the text, the font and the text size, text color, background color, and stuff like that. So that's how we would change it upon load up. So everything that's in this attribute section that we assign up here is basically going to be, that's how it's going to look once the app loads. And unless we change these attributes within the text, this is how it's always going to look. Okay, and then we added in a label as well, and that just kind of helped us demonstrate how to retrieve some of the properties. Okay, so the next thing we did is we then dragged and dropped it into the button into the code just by right-clicking on it and dragging it into the appropriate place. So with the button, we had to add in a variable, which was an outlet, and the outlet allows us to change the button properties within the code. And we also added in a button action, which was the button handler. So this function handled what would happen once the button was pressed, whereas again the outlet is just an object that allows us to modify the properties. We then created this change button properties function where we first implemented a couple of, well, we didn't implement, we first called a couple of functions, which were the set title and the set title color function. So in this way, we just reset the title from interesting text to Mammoth Interactive, and we set the color from the default blue color to red. Okay, so we first did that upon load up. So as soon as the function, or as soon as the app ran or loaded, we had these kind of properties change. Okay, and then we added in the label to the code, again just by right-clicking and setting it up as a variable. And we had these variables basically to retrieve properties. So in this way we demonstrated that we can both set the properties and retrieve them and store them in variables. Okay, and after we did that, we then implemented the button handler function, which is going to be the button action. So we just told it to call our change button properties. So this is basically just going to say that once this button is pressed, it's going to send this. The button's going to act as a sender, and it's going to trigger this event, which is going to be whatever is in this, or whatever's between these two parentheses, which in our case was the change button properties call. Now this changed things up a little bit. So our text and our button text and label text no longer changed upon startup. They only changed once the button was pressed. And that was the difference between adding it in the handler and having it in the view.did.load. In the view.did.load, it would change immediately once the app loaded, whereas once we put it in the button action function, it only changed once the button was pressed. And then so once the button was pressed, it changed the label text and color and the button text and color. Okay, so now we should know how to add in a button, change the properties using the attributes inspector, and change the properties in the text. And we should also be able to implement a button handler to have some kind of an event trigger once the button is pressed. Okay, so this is the basics of buttons in Swift 3 using Xcode 8.0. This has been the beta 2 version. So you should now be able to take this basic knowledge and expand upon it. So try out some of the new functions. Try setting stuff like images, because you can make your buttons look really cool if you want to add in images and stuff like that. There are many other properties to change other than the title and title color. I just kind of wanted to give you the basics rundown, because otherwise we could spend hours on buttons alone. Okay, so again, you should be able to create them, modify them, and add handlers to them. Right, well, thank you very much for watching our tutorial on buttons in Swift 3. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you learned a lot. And we have lots more tutorials to come. For example, we have our labels tutorial. We have a bunch of different like variables and functions and stuff like that. And yeah, we'll have many more to come, so stay tuned, and hopefully we'll see you next tutorial.